With the ongoing popularity of Wicked on the stage and, of course, the big screen, there is also a constant rediscovery by new generations of its source material, a little movie called The Wizard of Oz. Obviously, The Wizard of Oz does not need Wicked to stay alive in the public consciousness, since it is one of the biggest classics ever to come out of Hollywood. Beloved, parodied, cherished, remembered, full of unforgettable songs and popular characters. And it's also the most famous production many of its performers were ever involved in, and kept the names alive with movie audiences until this day. From Ray Bolger to Billy Burke, and Frank Morgan to Margaret Hamilton. It is in fact a movie so well known that it even became the most famous reference point for an actress who actually wasn't even in it. Because from what I see on the internet today, it seems that the name Gale Sondergaard nowadays almost only comes up as the woman who was the original choice to play the Wicked Witch of the West, but dropped out when the character was rewritten in a way that did not appeal to her. But of course, there was much more to Gale Sondergaard. Noted for her intimidating and mysterious screen presence, she earned a reputation as one of the most captivating character actresses and intriguing talents of her time, giving chilling and sinister performances that left a lasting impact on movie audiences.
People would say you were usually evil.
Yes, well, I did a number of women. I don't deny that I was terrible sometimes, a terrible woman, you know.
And in 1937, Gale Sondergaard also made movie history by becoming the first woman to ever win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for her role in the Warner Brothers epic Anthony Adverse, at the time one of the biggest productions in Hollywood history. But success and downfall were connected very closely in Gale Sondergaard's life, as her career was tragically linked to one of the darkest periods in American history that put a sudden end to her work as a motion picture actress for 20 years.
Any real American would be proud to answer the question, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Gale Sondergaard was a very fascinating actress and a highly admirable person who deserves to be remembered for more than simply not doing The Wizard of Oz. This is why in this video I want to go into the dynamics of her career, the communist witch hunt that destroyed it, and the courage she showed in the face of adversity and hostility, and why a battle between the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and the Screen Actors Guild enabled her to win the first ever Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. Gale Sondergaard was born as the daughter of Danish immigrants in Litchfield, Minnesota in 1899.
Well, I was born Edith Holm Sondergaard.
And you say Sondergaard?
Well, you want it Danish?
Mm-hmm.
Synagog.
Synagog?
Synagog.
Her father worked as a buttermaker in a creamery and later taught the cooperative movement at the University of Wisconsin, while her mother, a former concert pianist, taught music and a love for the arts to Edith and her two sisters.
Were you a bit of a rebel as a child? From what I've been able to gather about your childhood,
well, I would think I was a rebel, except that I would think my parents were also, because my parents were very progressive people in everything, you know, came from Denmark when they were teenagers, by each separately, not together, met in this country. And they had read Henrik Ibsen, and my mother already understood Nora very well and believed that a woman should make her own way and earn her own living and everything, go down the line. This is how they were way ahead of, I don't think it's ahead of their time, because their time had a lot of that feeling.
Your mother was what is known as a Lucy Stone.
Well, Lucy Stoner is because she believed in a woman keeping her own name.
This childhood in a very left-leaning environment had a strong influence on the young Edith and later shaped the course of her entire life. But beyond this, she resisted most of her parents' influence, neither interested in following the career path of her father, nor showing any curiosity in the musical teachings of her mother. Instead, Edith had a strong fascination for acting since she was a little girl, starring in many neighborhood and elementary school plays.
And then one day when I was in high school, we were supposed to read from anything we wanted to choose, just read in front of the class. I picked out a very emotional scene of Rebecca in the novel Ivanhoe, and I stood there reading and enjoying myself tremendously. And I noticed the teacher was standing at the back of the room looking out the window, and I thought, I guess I'm not doing so well, but I didn't care. I went right on reading this thing and emoting and enjoying it. And at the end of the time, the teacher came to me and put her hands, 2 hands on my shoulders and looked in my eyes with such intensity that I was terrified. She said, "Have you ever studied dramatic art?" I said, "No, I didn't know what she was talking about." She said, "You must." So I went home and told my mother that the teacher said I must study dramatic art, and she took me to a dramatic school. And that was the beginning. I didn't know it was acting even. It was elocution, it was reading, it was feeling, it was laughter, it was everything. But that was the beginning.
After graduating from high school in 1917, where her yearbook stated that she had the heart to conceive, the understanding to direct, and the hand to execute, Edith attended the Minneapolis School of Dramatic Art and the University of Minnesota to study music and dramatic arts, and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and Public Speaking in 1921. During these years, she also gained her first experiences as a professional actress, getting engagements at various stock companies during her summer breaks at the university and traveling the country in a vast variety of different parts and plays. And at some point, also changed her first name from Edith to Gale, feeling that it sounded more appropriate for an actress and also would look better on a marquee. Beginning to get noticed as an intriguing and talented stage presence, Gale's career then developed rather quickly. She joined the John Keller Shakespeare Touring Company, performing in plays like Hamlet or The Merchant of Venice, and became a member of the John Bonstell Stock Company in Detroit. In 1928, she then achieved a first big step when she got a contract with the prestigious Theatre Guild in New York, making her Broadway debut as a witch in Faust, and later getting her first break when she replaced Judith Anderson as Nina in Eugene O'Neill's Strange Interlude to loud and strong acclaim, critics praising her as one of Broadway's most versatile and talented performers. The race for her work also reached the ears of Hollywood, which was looking for talented stage actors meeting the demands of the increasingly popular talking pictures, but Gale Sondergaard later said that she never even answered any of the letters she received from the big studios. Her interest was firmly set on the stage, and she continued to appear in plays like Major Barbara, American Dream, or Allison's House, and worked with names like Claude Rains, Alice Brady, Lee Strasberg, Humphrey Bogart, and Herbert Biberman. Born in March 1900 in Philadelphia as the son of Jewish immigrants from Russia, Herbert Biberman quickly decided that he was not interested in becoming a part of his father's closing firm, studying drama at Yale instead, and later traveling to Moscow to observe the emerging experimental theater. After his return to the US, he joined the Theatre Guild in 1928 as a performer and one of the Guild's most relevant experimental directors, directing Gale in various productions and also appearing as the man who murders her in the play Red Dust. Biberman and Gale Sondergaard quickly began to connect on a personal level as well due to their shared love for the arts and their similar political views, and they got married in 1930, continuing to work together on the stage and the radio for the next few years. Their lives were then forever changed in 1934 when Biberman's work as a director in New York caught the attention of Hollywood. And unlike his wife, he was highly interested, signing a contract with Columbia, which of course meant that he would have to move to Los Angeles. And this also forced Gale Sondergaard to make a choice, either stay in New York alone or give up her stage career and accompany her husband to Hollywood. And it was ultimately a surprisingly easy decision for her. I considered myself an established Broadway leading lady at the moment, but when Herbert got the contract, I said, "I'm not going to stay in New York while you go to Hollywood." And so they both left Broadway behind and moved into a house below the Hollywoodland sign. Biberman immediately started to work on his first movie, the crime drama One Way Ticket, while Gale Sondergaard settled into her private life.
My career had always been the core of my being, And I went with him, and for 6 months I had a marvelous time. I'm an outdoor gal. I went to the mountains and the ocean and beaches and lakes and had a gorgeous time.
For Gale Sondergaard, moving to Hollywood meant stopping her work as an actress, as she had not changed her opinions about movies during the last couple of years. I sincerely believed that I did not belong in motion pictures. I didn't think I was photogenic. But she would very soon be proven completely wrong about this assumption. In 1934, director Mervyn LeRoy was traveling on a cruise ship when he noticed that basically everyone aboard was occupied with the same book. I saw many people reading the current bestseller Anthony Adverse, so I borrowed a copy. As soon as I became immersed in it, I decided I wanted to make the film version. I cabled Jack Warner, "You must read Anthony Adverse." Back came his reply, "Read it? I can't even lift it." Even though the 1,200 pages long Anthony Adverse by author Hervey Allen is largely forgotten today, it was one of the biggest literary successes of its time. The best-selling book of 1933 and 1934, with around 400,000 sold copies, read all around the world, beloved, discussed, an omnipresent piece of contemporary art.
Anthony Adverse, please.
I'm sorry, I just saw the last copy.
Oh, I'm so disappointed. I've heard so much about Anthony Adverse, I can hardly wait to read it.
It's selling so fast it's difficult to keep it in stock, but I'm expecting another shipment tomorrow.
Save me a copy, would you please?
Yes, of course.
Anthony Adverse was essentially Gone with the Wind before there was Gone with the Wind, and paved the way for other, extremely long historical novels. But it seems that this also led to Anthony Adverse's slow descent into oblivion. Because when the actual Gone with the Wind marched through the door that Anthony Adverse had opened in 1936, it immediately became an unprecedented literary phenomenon, and when people now had to decide which 1,000+ pages long novel they wanted to read, the answer was pretty unanimous from now on. And then of course, this success also caused one of the biggest movie classics in Hollywood history. A true epic in every sense of the word, still the most successful movie of all time adjusted for inflation. It's the kind of classic that lives on to this day and, of course, also helps to keep the memory of Margaret Mitchell and her bestseller alive. The movie version of Anthony Adverse? Not so much. But it's not like Hollywood didn't try. Author Hervey Allen maybe said in 1934 that he couldn't see how his novel could ever be turned into a movie, but when Jack Warner eventually read Anthony Adverse after Mervyn LeRoy's suggestion, he decided that this could be the kind of prestige material that finds success with critics and audiences, and acquired the movie rights for his studio. And the making of Anthony Adverse as a movie again draws comparisons to Gone with the Wind. Just like Hollywood had thought that David O. Selznick could never turn Margaret Mitchell's novel into a success, many equally believe that Warner took a risk that would never pay off with Anthony Adverse. How could this long story with all its characters and different locations, from Cuba to Portugal to Italy, ever be turned into one motion picture? There were even discussions about doing something that would undoubtedly be done today, turning it into 2 movies, but in the end, Warner hired screenwriter Sheridan Gibney, who took 5 months to trim the plot of Hervey Allen's novel down to what would eventually be a 140 minutes motion picture. And again, like with Gone with the Wind, the press accompanied essentially every step of the shooting of Anthony Adverse as well, with most of the attention, of course, on the casting. In 1935, the press actually called Anthony Adverse the most difficult to cast motion picture in Hollywood history. Warner Brothers even made a nationwide poll among movie fans to find out who they wanted to see on the screen. The results had Leslie Howard as Anthony and Bette Davis as his love interest Angela. But polls like this were obviously just a part of Warner's publicity campaign, and the studio was also looking itself for the right performers, making over 600 screen tests overall. For the male lead, names besides Leslie Howard included Robert Donat, Errol Flynn, George Brent, and even James Cagney, before it was announced that Anthony would be played by Academy Award winner Frederick March. And while Bette Davis, fresh from her success with Of Human Bondage and Dangerous, and of course under contract to Warner's, felt like the obvious choice for the female lead, the studio was skeptical that she fitted the demands of the traditional love object, and after other names like Claudette Colbert and Barbara Stanwyck were considered, The part went to Warner's rising star Olivia de Havilland, who had just made her first big impressions with A Midsummer Night's Dream and Captain Blood. Other actors like Edmund Gwenn, Anita Louise and Claude Rains then joined the cast in supporting roles. In Warner's movie poll, Aline McMahon had been the #1 choice to play the scheming, villainous housekeeper Faith Paleologus, a woman causing children to run away in terror whenever she appears, ruling over the house of Anthony's grandfather with a born authority despite her standing as a servant. Faith was undoubtedly one of the most memorable and talked about characters of Hervey Allen's book, and so, despite the relatively small screen time, she became one of the most sought after roles of the year. A rare female villain, a well-known and much discussed character, awaited with keen interest by the novel's many fans. But for the longest time, nothing of this had anything to do with Gale Sondergaard, who was still enjoying her new life away from the stage and acting in general, and not aware of the pre-production happening for Anthony Edwards.
Well, what lured you into the movies if you were
Well,
so
there was a
dead
young
set
man
against them?
there in an agency that my husband had been assigned to by his New York agent. And he kept saying, let me take you around, let me take you around. You're an actress? And I said, no, I don't belong in motion pictures. Forget it. And then he came to me one day and he said, well, look, they're doing a film called Anthony Adverse, and they want an unknown face, and Mervyn LeRoy insists he wants an unknown face. They thought about Betty Davis doing it, but it's not the big star role, and they want an unknown face. Would you at least come to meet Mervyn LeRoy? And I said, well, I'd be glad to meet Mervyn LeRoy, but and he finished the sentence, you see. So Mervyn LeRoy later told me that as I walked through the door with some silver looped earrings, that was Faith Paleologus.
Reluctantly, Gale Sondergaard agreed to do a screen test for Leroy, and the role was hers. As she said, so all my noble protestations about giving up my career flew out of the window, and a whole new career opened up. After the cast was finally put together, shooting for Anthony Edwards could begin in November 1935. And again you can say that Anthony Edwards was Gone with the Wind before there was Gone with the Wind. The movie featured almost 100 actors with speaking parts and more than 2,000 actors overall. 131 sets were built on the backlot of the studio, more than 3,000 costumes designed, and overall more than $1 million spent.
This is a model of the convent where Anthony as a baby was abandoned by Don Dewey.
And this is the courtyard of the Casa de Bonifeather, where Anthony meets Angela for the first time.
And this is a model of the African trading post, where Anthony becomes involved with Nelita, the beautiful native girl.
After 13 weeks of shooting, an eternity at the time, the editor of Anthony Edwards was given 700,000 feet of film. The gigantic proportions of the production expectedly caused an almost unprecedented excitement for Anthony Edwards, which culminated in 12,000 fans gathering for the premiere in the summer of 1936. So was it all worth it? Well, let's say yes and no. Despite the huge investments, the movie still became the hoped-for financial hit and made Warner's a lot of money. But from a critical point of view, you can say that the comparisons to Gone with the Wind end here. Some reviewers certainly applauded the scale of Anthony Edwards, the sheer magnitude of the production, and the courage of the studio for bringing the story to the screen, calling it one of the best movies of the year, an exciting and remarkable realization of a beloved story. But the praise was certainly not unanimous, and many critics stated that the movie lacked life and energy, that it failed to turn the complexities of the novel into a coherent story, and that it was maybe a big picture, but not a great one. The New York Times stating that too much talent was wasted through a pointless script and unimaginative direction. Critics were equally split on the leading players, some saying that Frederick March had never been better, others calling him hopelessly miscast, a sentiment that co-star Olivia de Havilland agreed with, later saying that she found it impossible to play a love scene with March and feeling that Errol Flynn would have been a much better choice for the role. Olivia's own work was also seen ambivalently, some reviewers calling her lovely and engaging, others describing her as limited and wasted in an uninteresting part. Much of the overall criticism for the movie and the performers in it came from the significant changes made from the source material, removing almost half of the plot of Hervey Allen's book and making major alterations to many of the characters which were so beloved by the novel's countless fans. But it was clear that many of these changes were not only necessary due to time restrictions, but also because many parts of the novel would never have been allowed to be replicated on the screen. And it was agreed right away by critics that no character had been changed more than that of Faye's Paleologus, the New York Times stating that the movie version of Faye was a complete departure from the character in the novel, where she was not only presented as a villainous authority figure, but also a nymphomaniac who had an affair with the underaged Anthony and whose major motivations against him were his unrequited feelings. But as Gale Sondergaard herself later said, that wasn't allowed in those days. The character was therefore rewritten to fit the demands of the Hayes office, now mostly acting as the antagonist to Anthony by craving the money that was left to him by his grandfather for herself. However, while the changes to the character left some viewers disappointed, essentially everybody agreed that Gale Sondergaard still brought the character from the pages of the book to the screen as well as humanly possible under the circumstances, filling her with an undeniable spite that, quote, makes shivers run up and down your back. While one review stated that her smile pales from overuse, and to be honest, fair. Critics still called her the movie's standout, who gave an unusually superb performance, the diamond of the cast who was just as detestable as she needed to be, and that she went beyond the script to make Faye one of the most alive characters in the production, creating her as a woman the audience loved to hate.
But I will have something for the life I've lived. The disappointment, the years of boredom. And you're the one who will give it to me.
I?
For the price of that picture. For the honor of a grandee of Spain whose pretty wife had a child. Hurts, doesn't it? Makes you cringe.
So Gale Sondergaard had passed her movie debut with flying colors, not only giving a performance that was met with overwhelming critical praise, but also brought to life one of the most talked about literary characters to the satisfaction of the novel's many admirers. For Warners, it was clear that they had an exciting new screen personality. Anthony Adverse producer Hal Wallace saying, "I believe Miss Sondergaard is a real find for pictures." She obviously didn't get the same kind of attention and publicity as, for example, MGM's newest screen star Louise Reiner, but the press loved to talk about her nonetheless. How she would spend her free time skiing, swimming or walking her dogs, and how she spoke German, French and Russian besides English and Danish, while her background as an experienced stage performer who played Shakespeare and O'Neill gave her an undeniable reputation as a serious artist, dedicated to her craft, unobsessed with star culture and fame. The Hollywood Reporter saying, "From the moment she is cast in a role, she devotes every minute of her time to a study of its characterization." Gale Sondergaard stuck out among the usual Hollywood actresses because she appeared so contradicting. Not a leading lady, but a dominating presence. Glamorous, but not the conventional glamour type. Not traditionally beautiful, but strangely exotic nonetheless. Exotic in a way that 1930s America could accept. Exotic like Connecticut-born Katharine Hepburn, German-born Marlene Dietrich, or Swedish-born Greta Garbo. Exotic in a way that was still familiar and acceptable, allowing Gale Sondergaard to be seen as alluring and tempting, but also distant and disciplined at the same time. But of course, even with all the praise for Gale Sondergaard and her performance in Anthony Adverse, one thing did not happen. There was no talk about an Academy Award for her work. After all, it was very unlikely that a character actress like her, with a small role like Faye, would be included among the Academy's Best Actress contenders. But there were some changes happening within the Academy that would soon put an unexpected, additional spotlight on Gale Sondergaard. During their early years, the Academy's acting honors focused their attention on the bigger stars of the screen and stage, leading players with a distinct name recognition. Oscars were for performers like Bette Davis, Clark Gable, Norma Shearer, Katharine Hepburn, or Frederick March. Certainly not for a character actress like Gale Sondergaard.
See, I'm just a servant.
But all of this changed at the ceremony in 1937, when the Academy introduced the categories of Best Supporting Actor and Best Supporting Actress of the Year. However, these awards were not created due to the goodness of the Academy's heart or its sudden love for character actors. Instead, it was part of a desperate strategy to stay relevant, to keep the Academy Awards and even the Academy itself alive. While the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences is mostly known for their annual awards ceremony today, this was not its original purpose. Founded by 36 important figures within the movie industry, among them the likes of Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Cecil B. DeMille, Louis B. Mayer, and Irving Thalberg, the organization was supposed to mediate labor disputes between the studios and their employees. However, many soon began to feel that the Academy was not neutral during these negotiations, but instead strongly influenced by the studios and would always put their interests first. Consequently, many studio employees decided to take action. In 1933, after the Academy tried to negotiate a deal that would allow studios to cut the salaries of their staff in half for a couple of months, screenwriters in Hollywood founded the Screenwriters Guild as their representative body, and the same year many actors, concerned over the demanded working hours by the studios, founded the Screen Actors Guild. And in January 1936, the directors followed with the Screen Directors Guild. Many members of these new guilds would consequently leave the Academy, which saw its own membership plummeting drastically during these years. And the guilds also did not care for the Academy's annual awards gala, actively advising its members to boycott the event, one trade paper at a time stating, "The sooner it is destroyed and forgotten, the better for the industry." So it was undoubtedly a very difficult time for the Academy and its president Frank Capra, who had taken over the position in 1935. Having just won a long-desired Oscar himself, he was determined to keep the Academy alive and also not to let their honors lose their importance and prestige. He had to find ways to make the awards again appealing to the guilds and its members. To achieve this goal, Frank Capra made a few changes to the awards for the 1935 Oscars, where Mutiny on the Bounty was the big winner. He opened the voting for Best Picture, which so far had been done only by producers, up to all Academy members, and he also hired Pricewaterhouse to count the ballots and give more credibility to the voting results, especially after the controversy surrounding Bette Davis's snub for Of Human Bondage 1 year prior. However, those changes were not enough to change the attitude of the guilds, which continued to call for a boycott of the ceremony. Finally, Frank Capra came up with a last attempt to increase the industry's interest and announced an honorary Oscar to D.W. Griffiths, one of the most influential early figures in motion picture history. As Capra later said, "We used him, but we had to have a hell of a drawing card to keep the Academy alive, to keep the lights burning. And he did bring the crowd in. Everybody was anxious to see W. Griffiths and pay homage to him." But even if some big names, like the year's acting winners Victor McLaglen and Bette Davis, or Irving Thalberg and Norma Shearer, attended the ceremony, the boycott by the guilds was still largely a success, as Capra had to invite many personal friends to the event, while the studios sent secretaries to fill the empty seats. Dudley Nichols, the evening's winning screenwriter of The Informer, not only stayed at home during the show, but also became the first person to decline the award, sending the statuette back to Frank Capra and writing, "3 years ago, I resigned from the Academy and, with others, devoted myself to organize the guild because I had become convinced that the Academy would not function for the purposes for which it had been dedicated, and that in any major disagreement between employed talent and the studios, it would operate against the best interests of talent." It was clear that Frank Capra, if he wanted to keep the Academy Awards going, had to implement even more changes the next year. And so he again made various adjustments for the 1936 awards. A 50-person committee representing the 5 branches of the Academy, producers, writers, directors, actors and technicians, was created to determine the nominees for the major categories. As Capra said, "We feel that this committee of 50 will be able to give the various achievements of the year more individual discussion and consideration than could be done by the old method." And in regards to determining the actual winners, Capra made another big change and opened the voting up to all guild and union members, meaning that the Oscar winners would be chosen by more than 15,000 people. As Capra said about the guilds, "We practically kissed their asses to get them to stay in the Academy." But these changes did indeed help to increase the interest for the awards within the industry. However, Capra still needed to make more concessions to the Screen Actors Guild, which remained skeptical. First, he decided that the acting categories, which so far usually had 3 nominees in the past, would have 5 nominees from now on, reckoning that more room for performers would increase the award's appeal. And finally, to involve even more actors in the show, Capra introduced 2 new acting categories to the ceremony as well. As stated before, the Best Actor and Best Actress category were usually reserved for the studio stars, the upcoming and established talents, and their first priorities. The Screen Actors Guild, on the other hand, considered itself more as a home for character actors, performers with less income, less recognition, and most of all, less protection. So to appease the guild, Capra decided to pay attention to these kinds of character actors and actresses, who contribute to their movies from the sidelines with parts that did not carry their movies, but added important value and achievement. It was the beginning of Best Supporting Actor and Best Supporting Actress. And with this decision, performers who would never even have come close to an Oscar during their careers suddenly had a chance to share the spotlight and get the much-deserved recognition for their invaluable work. And finally, the Screen Actors Guild was convinced, stating that it did not intend to offer any objections to its members attending the dinner. For their very first year, the Academy's nominees for Best Supporting Actress were Beulah Bondi as the wife of President Andrew Jackson in the Joan Crawford vehicle The Gorgeous Hussy, Alice Brady as Carole Lombard's ditzy mother in My Man Godfrey, Bonita Granville as the little girl from Hell in These 3, Maria Uspenskaya as the disapproving would-be mother-in-law in Dodsworth, and Gale Sondergaard in Anthony Adverse. This lineup actually feels like a perfect start to this category, because it sees so many archetypes that will dominate Best Supporting Actress for the years to come. There is the nomination for a comedic performance, the nomination for a dependable veteran who steals the movie from far bigger names, the nod for a child actress, the nomination for a very small performance with just a few minutes of screen time, and the recognition of the screen newcomer, the supporting role in a big epic, and the occasional villain. Alice Brady was universally applauded for her comedic work in My Man Godfrey, reviews calling her a riot and hysterically funny, but if Anthony Adverse was seen as a movie where the supporting players overshadow the leading actors, this was not the case with My Man Godfrey, as most critics focused their praise on the work by William Powell and Carole Lombard. Beulah Bondi was often singled out in reviews of The Gorgeous Hussy, called touching and memorable as a woman who feels out of place in the role that her marriage had given her. She was easily the most praised aspect of her movie, but that didn't seem to be too big a stretch, as many critics found little to like in it otherwise. Maria Uspenskaya, a highly respected stage performer and acting teacher, who was already a kind of living legend in 1936, made her first movie appearance in William Wyler's Dodsworth, and despite only having one scene, pretty much walked away with the picture as far as the critics were concerned, who stated that she turned her brief appearance into a small masterpiece that achieved brilliant results. Browsing through contemporary reviews, I have to say that the most critical praise at the time was undoubtedly given to 13-year-old Bonita Grenville in these three. She was called the meanest girl on the screen today, who gave one of the best acting jobs of the year and effortlessly overshadowed her experienced co-stars Merle Oberon, Miriam Hopkins and Joel McCrea. In regards to this first Oscar race, there was little speculation about who would or should win the award. The category was still new, and most attention in the pre-Oscar coverage was on the leading categories, where Paul Muni and Louise Reiner appeared to be the favorites. However, a few articles did state that Bonita Grenville should win the award, while Daily Variety predicted a close race between Maria Uspenskaya and Gale Sondergaard. So after a quick look at this category, there is the question, why did Gale Sondergaard emerge as the first winner of the Best Supporting Actress Oscar? Obviously, these early races are very difficult to analyze, since circumstances were so different compared to today, and as just said, there weren't a lot of discussions about the singular instances of the category in the press, so I can only give a few personal observations on why I think Gale Sondergaard triumphed in the end. First of all, you can probably speculate that each of her co-nominees had certain factors against her. Bonita Grenville, despite all the critical acclaim, had the simple misfortune that she was still only 13 years old. As we know, the Academy tends to hesitate when awarding child performers, even creating a juvenile award for a short period of time to try to keep them away from the regular acting categories. Maria Uspenskaya, despite the respect for her as a performer and acting teacher, might have suffered from her screen time. We know that this category was introduced to award character actors in smaller roles, but most winners, even at the time, still had parts with more influence on the storyline and a larger overall impact on the audience. Beulah Bondi might have been seen as the highlight of the gorgeous hussy, but the movie likely felt too neglectable to many Academy members, while Alice Brady was in a comedy, a genre that the Academy tended to treat as second class pretty much right from the start, also demonstrated by the fact that all other nominated performers from My Man Godfrey lost in their categories as well. So looking at the competition, Gale Sondergaard just appears to have the most advantages in her corner. As mentioned before, she had strong reviews for her performance in Anthony Adverse, and also saw a lot of publicity as a new kind of screen actress who caused such a sensation with her first movie role. She furthermore played one of the most well-known characters in one of the most popular books of its time, and even if the role had been strongly adjusted for the screen, almost everyone still felt that she fulfilled all the expectations that had been associated with it.
You flatter me.
It was also a quite unusual role. A female villain who isn't punished for her actions, but gets away with everything she does and is even rewarded for it in the end. So the character certainly sticks out in the cinema landscape of 1936 and left a kind of lasting impression that dominated almost all discussions about Anthony Adverse. Prior to the Oscars, the press also named Gale the biggest scene stealer of the year, over performers like her co-nominee Beulah Bondi, but also Judy Garland in Pigskin Parade or Misha Auer in My Man Godfrey. And then of course, you cannot completely ignore studio politics. Anthony Adverse was Warner's biggest production of the year and obviously intended to walk away with some awards. With extras now being allowed to vote for the Oscar winners, Warner Brothers had the second largest voting body within the Academy, after MGM, which saw many of its contract players win during these years. Ahead of the 1936 Oscars, Daily Variety wrote that both studios essentially agreed to push each other for the awards, MGM instructing its employees to vote for Anthony Adverse and The Story of Louis Pasteur in various categories, while Warner's aimed to support MGM with wins for The Great Ziegfeld and its newest star Louise Reiner, which all worked quite well. The Great Ziegfeld won Best Picture and Best Actress, while The Story of Louis Pasteur won Best Actor for Paul Muni, and Anthony Adverse walked away with 4 Oscars overall, including 1 for Gale Sondergaard. But while it is important to mention these kinds of politics going on in the background, I also don't want to emphasize them too strongly, because it feels to lessen the quality and impact of the honored work. Louise Reiner undoubtedly gave the most acclaimed and most talked about female characterization of the year that would very likely have won under any circumstances, and Paul Muni was a highly respected performer who had more than enough admiration in the industry to win this award all by himself. And as mentioned before, Gale Sondergaard's work in Anthony Adverse and her entire personality as an actress were widely praised as well. But in a category without a clear frontrunner, the support from the biggest Hollywood studios was undoubtedly an important advantage for her. And so, due to the ongoing disputes between the Academy and the various guilds, Gale Sondergaard had been allowed to secure a permanent place in movie history as the first woman to ever win the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. And all of this for her very first motion picture.
Life is strange. Is it not, monsieur?
Suddenly, the reluctant movie actress became a prominent name in the industry, and decided that movie acting wasn't so bad after all, appearing in more than 30 movies over the next couple of years, becoming a familiar and instantly recognizable supporting player in a variety of different genres. However, her post-Oscar career still made it clear that the newly introduced category for supporting players did not have the same amount of prestige and importance as the leading categories. Even Gale herself later said, "If the award ever did anyone any good, it wasn't me. Because a supporting award in no way enhances a career or salary in the way that Best Actress does." And at the time, the statement was certainly true. Just look at how many of the Best Supporting Actress winners from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even the 60s were never nominated again after their wins, and very often never found another role that gave them the same kind of attention and critical praise. The leading category, on the other hand, does usually feel like a stepping stone for bigger things to come, a long and relevant career with even more acclaim and success in the future. Of course, this doesn't happen all the time, but there was a noticeable difference between both categories. After all, supporting players weren't even given an actual Oscar statuette, but only a plaque for the first few years of the category's existence. The supporting awards were mostly seen as a pat on the back, a generous gesture to allow the little people to be part of the club for one night, but they were not expected to suddenly become a big star or make a lot of money for the studio. Mostly, they were simply expected to continue to do what they had done so far, play the same kinds of roles in the same kinds of movies. And this was also the case with Gale Sondergaard. And since Anthony Adverse had been her first movie, it was the only reference point for audiences and movie makers when thinking about her capabilities as an actress. Sinister but intriguing, evil but intelligent, provocative but charming immediately became her trademarks. Already in 1937, Picture Play magazine called her the arch-villainess of the screen, and other outlets constantly described her as Hollywood's reigning female villain, who had a special talent for making the audience's blood run cold. This was how Hollywood saw her, and how movie studios cast her moving forward, counting on the type she had built to bring an easy-to-understand malevolence to all kinds of roles she played.
Look, I'll tell you what you do. Okay. You tell me what to do.
Mind your own business.
Right after her Oscar win, she appeared for example in The Maids of Salem, even though most of her part ended up on the cutting room floor, or as the evil sister in a remake of Seven's Heaven. That same year, she maybe also played one of her most conventionally likable characters, the supportive and suffering wife in the Best Picture winner The Life of Emile Zola, a movie that was one of her personal favorites, but by now it had become clear that if Gale Sondergaard appeared in a movie, it basically meant trouble. And audiences loved her for it.
Oh, pardon me, but didn't I see you in Rebecca?
Gale herself was not always happy about this typecasting, saying, "I don't want my screen life to be cluttered up with siren parts." But she still jokingly admitted that she had actually always been a witch in her career, since she had appeared on the stage in Faust in 1928. But Gale always made it clear that she never cared if the characters she played were good or bad, more interested about their inner life, and also unwilling to let their evilness define their entire personalities. Later saying, "I must say that in all the wicked women I've had to play in my life, and I've done a number, I refuse them being made ugly."
You have been wicked, I would say, more of the time than unwicked, haven't you, in your
you
career?
said more of the time, because I think you said usually out there, and I said no, not usually. The point is, I think that I've had more variety, actually, in roles than many, many other actresses in pictures or even on the stage. It's really true. Some people come to me and say, "You were always so terrible, I hated you." I said, "Please just drop the word always." That's how I feel about it, because I've played many, many kinds of characters.
It was a motto that showed how much she cared for the roles she played, but it would ultimately also prevent her from appearing in what would undoubtedly have been the most famous movie of her career. After completing The Life of Emile Zola, she followed director Mervyn LeRoy to MGM, where he produced a movie version of L. Frank Baum's novel The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And he was right away determined to cast Gale Sondergaard in the pivotal role of the Wicked Witch of the West, announcing her casting in August 1938. As LeRoy said, "I thought we should have a different kind of witch, one with class and maybe sex appeal. Gale Sondergaard will be our witch," a 1938 version.
So the costumes were made, a high pointed hat with sequins and a slinky sequins black gown and green eyes and big lashes and all that stuff for a wicked, glamorous witch. And we had tested the clothes with Judy Garland. We were all there testing because it was ready to go. And Mervyn came to me with a long face and he said, "Oh, Gale, all the producers in the studio say, you can't do that. It's a classic. Children expect an ugly witch, and grown-ups expect an ugly witch. You can't do that." Yeah, and so Mervyn said, "Gale, I don't want you to play an ugly witch." And I said, "Mervyn, I won't play an ugly witch."
It was a decision that Gale never regretted, later always complimenting Margaret Hamilton's by now legendary performance. Her withdrawal from The Wizard of Oz was also very easy for Gale, because she was overall extremely busy during these years, and had plenty of offers to pick from, appearing in movies like Varese with Bette Davis, or The Mark of Zorro with Tyrone Power, and even various comedies with Bob Hope, where she proved that she could also give her evil characters a very engaging comedic spin.
He fell off the Matterhorn.
Oh, that's a mountain.
13,669 feet. He was never found.
Did they look? Were you there, Mrs. Marco?
I saw it all. It was horrible. But when it happened, I wasn't a foot behind him.
Think of that. I'll bet you could have reached right out and touched him, eh, Mrs. Marco?
Easily.
And even though she was not in The Wizard of Oz, she did appear in 20th Century Fox's attempt to copy its success. The Blue Bird, another Technicolor fairy tale starring Shirley Temple, who had been one of the alternatives for the role of Dorothy, in which Gale Sondergaard played Tulette, a cat magically transformed into a human. However, the Blue Bird was not The Wizard of Oz, but rather a financial and critical disaster, referred to by some as the Dead Pigeon. One of her most famous roles today is opposite Bette Davis in The Letter, which was another part that she almost declined due to the intentions of the filmmakers to make the character look dowdy and unattractive.
And when they started bringing me in the wardrobe fittings, these horrible clothes that belonged just to a gutter woman, and this woman was married, had been married. The man who had had an affair with Bette Davis, who had shot him dead at the beginning of the film, had married me. I said, did that mean that that man had gone to the dogs and become a nothing, and that she was justified in killing him, shooting him dead because he'd married someone who was not all Caucasian? I said, is that why you're going to dress me like that? And Willie Wyler, the director, said, I think we better go home and come back tomorrow. And we went home and came back tomorrow, and he said, I couldn't sleep all night for what you said. You're right. She must have the dignity of a woman.
Gale Sondergaard later said that she loved the role, and that the more beautiful and dignified appearance of Mrs. Hammond gave the movie and her confrontation scene with Bette Davis a far more engaging spin. Betty Davis herself later complimented Gale's performance as breathtakingly sinister.
But this is one thing in these wicked roles that you speak of. I never played her ugly. If you look back over all the films
That's right, they were always very glamorous
I played against it, always. And it's much more intriguing if you don't know what a wicked woman who is, well, I'm modest, but I'll say it, who is glamorous. Mm-hmm. That's what they call me anyway, so I'm not making it up.
No, you always have been glamorous.
Well, I'm glad. I didn't understand that myself, like I thought I didn't belong in motion pictures. I never really understood why people said those things about me. It's true.
During the 40s, Gale Sondergaard then signed a contract with Universal, generally considered a step down for her, as the studio was mostly focused on lower budget productions during this time. But prestigious roles did no longer come to her as they used to at MGM or Warner Brothers, and she now played evil women in movies of less and less quality. Of The Black Cat, she for example said, "I hated doing that thing. It was beneath me." But she also did one of her most famous roles at Universal in the Sherlock Holmes movie The Spider-Woman, where she is described as a female Moriarty, a description that an actress like Gale Sondergaard certainly lives up to. A few years later, Universal cast her in The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, which was not a Sherlock Holmes movie and also not a sequel to The Spider-Woman, but rather an attempt to build a series around a similar character. But this time, Gale was much less thrilled.
What is the latest count, would you say, of the number of films you've done?
Well, I think it's around 42 or something like that, when you really count them all, some of which I would just soon eliminate. But it really isn't true. Some of them I didn't want to do, and I hated doing them, and I really rose up and said, please, no more, like that.
Did you?
Yes, I did, but I did them. I was under contract at the last, really, at Universal, and I did whatever they assigned to me, including The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, which followed The Spider-Woman, because The Spider-Woman had been so successful, they thought they'd make a series with me starring in them, and then out came this picture, and I was horrified. I hated it, I despised it, I loathed it.
Gale's most positive acting experience during the 40s came when she again worked for 20th Century Fox and appeared with Irene Dunne and Rex Harrison in Anna and the King of Siam. That was one of my favorite roles. I just loved this woman. Such a noble, wise, far-seeing woman who accepted her fate. Critics also adored her performance, calling her perfection, and she received her second Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress. Also, the award went to the favorite Anne Baxter in The Razor's Edge. For Gale Sondergaard, the return to the Oscars was an important confirmation of her talents and her continued efforts to do the best work she could. But it ultimately did not have any impact on her future as an actress, because her career suddenly came to a crashing halt. In the wake of World War II, the panic and hysteria over the threat of communism escalated to unprecedented levels in the United States. The House of Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, investigated basically all individuals and organizations suspected of having communist ties, and in 1947 began to focus more strongly than ever before on the entertainment industry, often viewed as a stronghold of anti-American and pro-communist views, for a possible infiltration of subversive propaganda into motion pictures. Numerous members of the film community were consequently subpoenaed, many of the early witnesses willingly cooperating with the committee. But in November 1947, 10 producers, writers and directors refused to hand over any information or answer the committee's most feared question: are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? They were later known as the Hollywood 10. Among them was Herbert Biberman.
It has become very clear to me that the real purpose of this investigation...
That is not...
Wait, into the component parts of the motion picture industry.
Ask him the next question. Ask him the next
Mr.
question.
Bieberman.
Ask him the next question.
Mr. Bieberman.
Go ahead, ask him the
Mr.
next
Bieberman. Are you a member of the Communist Party, or have you ever been a member
Are
of
you
the
a member of the
Communist
Communist Party?
I don't intend to go into all the details here that led to Biberman's subpoena, but in the anti-communist atmosphere of the late 1940s, he does appear like a perfect symbol of the left-leaning ideas in Hollywood that the committee craved to find. The Theatre Guild, where he had started his career, was by now seen as a hotbed for communism. He was a founding member of the Screenwriters Guild, which was equally seen more and more suspiciously. He had supported the Committee for Loyalist Spain and the Los Angeles chapter for Russian war relief, spoke at a number of rallies across the country, had been to Moscow during the 1920s, and of course, was the son of Jewish immigrants from Russia.
Always, he devoted his energies to decency and humanity. He is now in a federal prison.
All of this, of course, affected Gale Sondergaard too. Not just privately, but also professionally. Like her husband, she was also known for her left-leaning politics, her progressive upbringing, and her support for the Motion Picture Artists Committee to aid Republican Spain. Gale Sondergaard later said about all this, "I wouldn't know about the communists. We were anti-fascists. We were anti-Nazis." During the war, she had dedicated a lot of her time to the war efforts and giving anti-fascist speeches across the country, and already in 1936 she had founded the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League together with her husband and other colleagues. But by now, anti-fascist for many only meant pro-communist, and the Anti-Nazi League was soon called a Communist Front organization.
As far as I was concerned, it was how I was brought up. It was my thinking. There was nothing else. I couldn't possibly adjust to any other way of thinking except in a progressive way, as far as the world was concerned, as far as happiness of the human beings in the world was concerned, you know?
And so, due to her own activities and her marriage to a man who refused to cooperate with HUAC, Gale Sondergaard was essentially grey-listed. After having worked almost non-stop for the last years, she did not appear in a movie in 1948 and was only cast as Barbara Stanwyck's mother in East Side West Side in 1949 due to the influence of her old friend Mervyn LeRoy. The director wanted to see how the industry would react to her appearance, but he later admitted to Gale that many colleagues had come up to him and asked him if he was unaware of who she was and how he could have let her appear in his movie. It was her last appearance in front of a camera for 20 years. When Anthony Adverse was re-released in 1948, the posters did not even mention the Oscar winner. In 1950, Herbert Biberman was officially sentenced to jail for 6 months for contempt of Congress. Gale Sondergaard would focus all her attention now on her husband and gave speeches on behalf of the Hollywood 10, while the major studios, pressured by organizations like the American Legion, which threatened to boycott movies that involved any artists who had refused to answer the committee's questions, had already published the so-called Waldorf Statement, in which they condemned the Hollywood 10 and swore to not knowingly employ any members of the Communist Party. Gale Sondergaard was soon after named for alleged communist beliefs, along with 150 other people from the entertainment industry, in Red Channel's The Report of Communist Influence in Radio and Television, a pamphlet that became the basis for blacklisting in the entertainment industry, as many of the mentioned artists were dropped by their agencies and found it impossible to get any more work. As Gale said, "If you were named, you didn't work." It was as simple as that. You could be blacklisted if you'd merely signed a petition for peace, for civil rights, an anti-war petition, against nuclear testing. Anything could be labeled a communist front. The bully's goal was to scare people out of speaking up or protesting anything, including discrimination.
And one morning, my young son, what was he then, 4 or 5, something like that, came up, running up the front steps of our house and said, "Mom, somebody wants to see you." So I came down the steps, and here was this man. Well, I don't think I'll attempt to describe him, but he had a piece of pink paper, and he said, "Miss Sondergaard, this is for you." And this was my subpoena. father is just out of jail. There was no point in a mother leaving the small children also to go to jail. But it seemed to me sensible for me now to be allowed to stay home with my children. And I felt that I would rather invoke the Fifth Amendment.
But while most artists who were subpoenaed at the time tried their best to keep their hearings as quiet as possible to avoid any coverage in the press, or often cooperated with the committee to not damage their careers, Gale Sondergaard became one of the loudest voices within the Hollywood community against HUAC and the blacklisting, together with actor Howard Da Silva, who had to testify on the same day. In an attempt to force the Screen Actors Guild to get involved in her case, she wrote a public letter to the organization, which she published in the press. Dear board members, I am addressing you because I have been subpoenaed together with other members of your union before the Un-American Activities Committee. I would be naive if I did not recognize that there is a danger that by the following day I may have arrived at the end of my career as a motion picture actress. Surely it is not necessary for me to say to this board that I love my profession. Surely it is also not necessary for me to state that I consider myself a deeply loyal American with genuine concern for the welfare and peace of my own countrymen and all humanity. A blacklist already exists. It may now be widened. It may ultimately be extended to include any freedom-loving nonconformist, or any member of a particular race, or any member of a union. For my own security, for the security of all our members, I ask our board whether it can afford to witness its approach with passivity. I can find no reason in my conduct as an actress or as a union member why I should have to contemplate a severing of the main artery of my life, my career as a performer. The board of the Screen Actors Guild, under the presidency of none other than Ronald Reagan, was forced by Gale's public letter to write a response, which it also published in the press. Your letter attacks the hearing of the House Committee on Un-American Activities into alleged Communist Party activities and asks that the Guild protects you against any consequences of your own personal decisions and actions. Like the overwhelming majority of the American people, we believe that a clear and present danger to our nation exists. The Guild Board believes that all participants in the International Communist Party conspiracy against our nation should be exposed for what they are, enemies of our country and of our form of government. The Guild as a labor union will fight against any secret blacklist created by any group of employers. On the other hand, if any actor by his own actions outside of union activities has so offended American public opinion that he has made himself unsaleable at the box office, the Guild cannot and would not want to force any employer to hire him. That is the individual actor's personal responsibility, and it cannot be shifted to his union. In other words, Gale Sondergaard and every other performer were on their own. The press consequently followed the hearings of Gale Sondergaard and Howard Da Silva in March 1951 with a lot of attention, calling Da Silva loud and aggressive, Gale quiet and reserved, but also made it very clear that both were unfriendly witnesses, pleading the Fifth Amendment during their hearings and refusing to cooperate. During the hearing, Gale said, "May I say everybody is branding every progressive organization which has done good work as subversive. This I find very sad and shocking. I cannot but be saddened and angered by this new offensive against the progressive conscience of Hollywood. I think any American citizen has the right to any political belief." After her hearing, there was some speculation that Gale, like her husband, might face charges for contempt of Congress. This did not happen, but following the news about her unwillingness to answer the committee's questions, and after other actors like Larry Parks and Lee J. Cobb named her as a member of the Communist Party during their own hearings, her career in movies was indeed effectively over. But Gale Sondergaard still refused to back down. In 1953, she and other blacklisted performers like Anne Revere or Howard Da Silva sued the major Hollywood studios for loss of employment opportunities. Unsurprisingly, without any success. She spoke openly about being blacklisted by the industry in the following years, and in 1956 was called to testify at HUAC for a second time. A report on blacklisting, released by the Fund for the Republic, had stated that hundreds of performers, including Gale, had suffered damages to their careers after their hearings, which was, unsurprisingly, strongly denied by the committee and its supporters. Gale was asked about these claims during her hearing, and she again stood her ground, strongly emphasizing her belief that she was out of work in motion pictures due to the fact that she had not cooperated with HUAC. She was also again asked about her own political beliefs and those of friends and colleagues, but like she had done in 1951, she again pleaded the Fifth Amendment. It remained clear that there would be no return for her to any productions from any Hollywood studios. 2 years prior, in 1954, it had briefly seemed that Gale Sondergaard might actually appear in a movie again, after her husband had founded the independent production company to make a film about the strike of Mexican-American zinc miners in New Mexico at the beginning of the 50s, called Salt of the Earth.
And Herbert directed it, my husband, and it's about the strike, actually, which happened, and it's written on that. The strike of the miners, the Mexican-American miners, to get some kind of equality with the Anglo miners, for have running water in their homes and, just sanitary things and other things like that, wages and such. So that's the story, and how the women took over the picket line when they were stopped by the Taft-Hartley bill, and how the women really won that strike.
As many other people involved with the production had been blacklisted as well, from screenwriter Michael Wilson to actor Will Greer, later mostly known for his work on The Waltons, Salt of the Earth was one of the first entirely independent movie productions made outside of the studio system. Shot in a naturalistic style, the movie featured mostly non-professional actors, but the central role, the wife of one of the town's miners, was written specifically for Gale Sondergaard. For her, it was undoubtedly an important but also long-desired opportunity. The chance to return to movie acting, which she had missed so much. The chance to overcome the blacklist and the possibility to work again under the direction of her husband for the first time since they had been members at the Theatre Guild in New York more than 20 years ago. As Gale later said, "I get great pleasure out of working. I like to create. That is when I come alive." And she hadn't felt alive in the sense for many years. However, during the pre-production of the movie, Gale began to realize that her presence would not work within the kind of realism the movie wanted to portray, saying, "The role was written for me, but only a Mexican could have played it." So she decided to withdraw from the role and instead supported her husband with the making of the movie behind the camera. Unsurprisingly, the shooting of Salt of the Earth was observed very closely by the US government, and news outlets right away condemned it as dangerous and communist propaganda. The production was consequently disturbed and threatened from all sides, including anti-communist vigilantes shooting at the set and actress Rosaura Revueltas being deported to Mexico. The movie was also stored and edited in secret, as there was a constant danger that the prints might be destroyed. Salt of the Earth was eventually released in March 1954, but given the atmosphere at the time, it was both a critical and financial flop, and studios threatened to boycott all distributors who carried the film. Hollywood sent a clear signal. For blacklisted artists, independent movie making was no alternative. For Gale Sondergaard, any hope of appearing in a future movie by her husband had been destroyed for good, and Herbert Biberman gave up his work as a director and became a land developer in Beverly Hills. During these years, Gale Sondergaard did not give up her own work as an actress completely. The stage was not as affected by the witch hunt as the motion picture industry, and she appeared in summer stock and various regional theatre productions. In 1956, She played the Helen Hayes role in the stage version of Anastasia in Philadelphia, but even here, protesters of the American Legion demonstrated against her appearance. But just like always, Gale Sondergaard was not intimidated by the opposition to her work and the protests against her, and was ultimately able to play her part as planned. However, even though stage appearances were rare, Gale Sondergaard had not quietly accepted her subpoenas and her blacklisting. She had instead openly and loudly refused to cooperate with HUAC and publicly condemned their work and its effect on her career again and again, making her name too big a risk even for many theatre productions. She therefore again decided to focus more attention on her private life, like she had done when she had first come to Hollywood 20 years ago. I was very happy those first years. I devoted all my time to my children. I was always busy. I became Mummy Gale. No more governesses or nurses or housekeepers. You might say I raised my children and did some touring theatre. It doesn't sound too bad that way. In 1964, Gale and her family moved to New York, and the next year she appeared off-Broadway in her own one-woman show titled Woman, her emergence into fuller status as a human being in relation to her mate, which she also performed on tour across the country, and in 1967 she garnered positive attention for her appearance in The Visit in Minneapolis. During this time, Gale was also given an Outstanding Achievement Award from the University of Minnesota. Just like her life and her career had been strongly shaped by the actions of HUAC almost 20 years ago, it was now again influenced by the growing rejection of these past politics. It was the time of rehabilitation, when the atmosphere in the country slowly changed in regards to McCarthyism, and what had appeared as righteous and patriotic was now seen as horrendous and despicable. Of course, destroyed careers couldn't be mended again, and apologies often felt hollow in the face of what people had been through, but it enabled a certain return for some. Gale Sondergaard's old friend Howard Da Silva, for example, started to work again in 1962 in David and Lisa. However, many other performers found a return to motion pictures very difficult, having lost their name recognition and, of course, spending many years away from the screen. An actress over 60 will always have difficulties to find a good role, or any role for that matter. But an actress over 60 who hadn't acted in a movie since 1949 and was basically unknown by this point? Gale Sondergaard's return to the screen in 1969 in the pre-Civil War drama Slaves, loosely based on Uncle Tom's Cabin, was therefore mostly made possible by the fact that the movie also marked the return of her husband Herbert Biberman as a director. It was his first motion picture since Salt of the Earth 15 years earlier, and the first time the two of them worked together again in many years. Unlike Salt of the Earth, Slaves was certainly not written with Gale Sondergaard in mind, and she only had a small role in the movie, but the return of her and Herbert Biberman from the blacklist did cause a lot of attention in the press, giving Gale the chance to retell her story and educate people on what had happened to so many artists during the McCarthy era, but also emphasizing that she wanted to leave the past behind her. Politics don't interest me very much. I live my own life. I have always known what I felt and thought.
That was a bad period, and anybody will admit it today, that it was an ugly, bad period in our country. It had nothing to do with our democratic form of government, and we were all called in front of the Un-American Activities Committee at that time, and the stand that we took, and I was one of them there too, the stand was that it was the committee was unconstitutional, and that they were really stepping and throwing out the First Amendment, which gives everyone the possibility of thinking as they wish to think and associating as they wish to associate. And that's what it was all about. It was just a bad period after the war.
The excitement about the return of Gale Sondergaard and Herbert Biberman as artists was ultimately, however, larger than the excitement about their actual return with Slaves, which was met with mixed to negative reviews, but the New York Times said that Gale's small role was the one pleasant thing about Slaves, and that her appearance recalled many memorable appearances in earlier, happier times. For Herbert Biberman, Slaves was his final motion picture, as he died from bone cancer 2 years later in 1971. For Gale Sondergaard, now 70 years old, Slaves was also not a return to her peak years in Hollywood, and she did not make any truly noticeable appearances anymore, but she was still overjoyed to work steadily again. For example, in TV productions like It Takes a Thief with Robert Wagner and The Best of Everything with Geraldine Fitzgerald and Patty McCormack, or on the stage opposite performers like Jane Alexander, Sandy Dennis or Charlton Heston. In 1973, Charlton Heston surprised Gale Sondergaard with an Oscar statuette to replace the plaque she had received in 1936. For her, all this sudden attention and all these new opportunities and engagements seemed like a miracle. I just look at the natural progress of history going on, and thank goodness, within my lifetime, it has gotten better. One of my deepest regrets is that Herbert isn't here today to see what is happening to me, because it is really phenomenal.
What do I do next?
You're in rehearsal.
I'm in rehearsal, yes. Yes, for many, many years ago that I played on Broadway. I was here 3 years ago at the Mark Taper, at the Roundabout Theatre playing in an Ibsen play, John Gabriel Borkman, which was a wonderful experience for me in Ibsen, you know, tremendous. I enjoyed it so much.
Is it ever discouraging when someone sees you in Ibsen and then comes back and says, I just have to get your autograph because The Spider-Woman is my favorite movie?
That's okay with me.
It's all right.
Oh, of course. No. I'm not embarrassed about any roles I've played at all.
Continuing to act until 1983, Gale Sondergaard died in August 1985 at the age of 86 in Los Angeles after suffering several strokes. During her life, Gale Sondergaard's career reached both the highest highs and lowest lows. A spectacular start in movies, followed by Hollywood's inability to think outside its comfort zone, and finally completely destroyed by the industry's submission to hate and marginalization. There were many fascinating portrayals we were never allowed to see, complex characterizations never allowed to happen. But Gale Sondergaard never looked back in regret or anger, but was content that she always did what she felt was right for her entire life. I feel no bitterness. If you allow yourself to grow bitter, you only hurt yourself. The progressives are always being pushed down by the establishment. I'm very proud of having been a part of that period. I am proud to have taken a stand. A friend once mentioned that from my screen appearances, you wouldn't guess that I had anything approaching a sunny disposition. But your disposition depends mostly on you. I had to work hard to keep mine through the difficult times. Too many innocent people gave in and took their own lives. I simply felt that when you do that, in a way the bad people win. In the end, survival is its own reward.
I think we make strides. I think that there is always progress. I believe I'm an optimist, you see. No matter what I hear or what I see going on, I'm still an optimist about people really finding out what is best for everybody, not just a few. This is my philosophy.